of standing in front of the boss. It's a way of walking away from the boss. And what I found very interesting is then to think about resistance. Resistance is another way. It's another physical posture. It's another way of being in the world. And if you think of Toy Toy, I mean, Toy Toy, Toy Toy is, it's so embodied, it's unbelievable. It's so much a movement that is enormously eloquent, that captures so much and speaks so much. Habitus starts, for me, started pointing towards that. But then it has all the problems that we've been talking about. The problems of, well, how does habitus change? How do you encompass contradiction? How do you think about that? And I think Michael has answered that brilliantly, and I think his last chapter in this book is quite an extraordinary discussion of habitus and how one might think about it and what its limits are. But really, Peter asked the question: well, how might one rethink or revamp habitus? Actually, what I was distracted by, and what I found more interesting, was Bourdieu on symbolic violence and symbolic order. And I picked out in my last chapter a section of just a few pages in Pascalian Meditations, where Bourdieu, in himself, wrestling with this problem. How do you, if you've got a model of habitus and field that are so locked together that change can't enter into them, how do you think about change? How do you begin to think about it? And he starts talking about the symbolic realm providing a margin of freedom. And suddenly there's an indeterminacy. Suddenly there's a sense of a world of possibilities that may be filled by wild prophecies that bear no relation to reality, or they may be filled by a vision of an alternative, maybe a little alternative, that people can rally around and talk about the present in a different way. And that's what I really started to find exciting. So, to come to Peter's point about transformation and the lack of evidence, well, I suppose one answer to that is just to say that, well, this is an invitation to research. So let's go out and explore the evidence. I think in the way that Jeremy was talking about, the sort of interplay between order and disorder. And I'm sort of well aware of the fact that I zero in on the disorderly moments and pull those out and try and understand them. And there's another dynamic, which is that of order that is entwined with disorder. And I think that it requires a lot of research, a lot of thinking, a lot of conversations to work through that interplay and some of those meanings. But to come to Peter's point about transformation, what really intrigued me about the research we were doing on township protests, as well as xenophobic violence, was the sense of a symbolic order in a state of enormous flux. A sense that the kind of symbols, the symbolic order does not hold, that it slides. And to try, how do I capture that? Well, you'll have to read, obviously you'll have to buy and read the book. But there's a moment in a particular township where the mayor, who is being protested against, calls the youngsters who are protesting unwashed, ducker-smoking boys. This meaning that their protests are illegitimate. They are not part of the community. This can simply be dismissed. In turn, they label the mayor an uneducated former tea girl. I think she worked in a post office or something. Now there's an intense kind of symbolic battle over what legitimacy and status means in this place. And that was really what struck me about the processes of transformation that I was looking at, or arguing, take place there, is the sense that people are making up distinction, trying to make up distinction, trying to settle questions of status, and battling over questions of status all the time. And you just have to think of the battles within the ANC now over what is the legitimate history of the ANC? What is discipline in the ANC? These questions are all up for grabs. And you can look at corruption as well. It's got different meanings. There's a whole set of probably most people in this room, including myself, who say corruption, well, it's stealing from the state, it's stealing from the people, it's a bad thing. But you've got to get up close to it, and what you find out is that there's a whole rationale for it. That people are doing it, regarding it as a legitimate practice. So there's a symbolic struggle over these things. And that's what I really found to be the most powerful dimension in Bourdieu that needed more work. And I think yes, so I suppose, Chairperson, I mean, there are many unsettled questions here, and I think that, it's great. Jeremy and Peter have raised some of them. There are others, of course, as well. But really, I see this as an invitation to a long conversation and a lot of work in trying to grasp afresh what this changing world is that we live in, and not to retreat to I suppose, the easy narratives that tell us what's going on, but actually don't tell us, I think, a lot about what's going on. Thanks.
I'll agree with Peter. Certainly there's new research that needs to be done, but also when you leave...
Hi, Michael.
Michael and Eddie doesn't want to talk to us. There's a question that's Tessa. Hi, I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book yet, but just based on the discussion that I've had so far, and even the way the book is constructed, I'm wondering what we can learn pedagogically from the book, in terms of what we can learn about teaching theory, because I think that part of what Jeremy was speaking about, in terms of having these romantic ideas about how theories come about and what theorists have to say, in some ways we teach theory as truth. And we teach students to see these theorists as figures of authority in ways that they don't converse with it. And they don't know how to bring them to their realities. And I think the sociology department here is a good example of being good Marxist on that basic principle, treating it as truth. And so what have we learned from this process about pedagogy and speaking and having conversations with theorists as opposed to accepting them as romantic truth? Another comment, question? You're not allowed to say anything negative about the Department of Sociology at the university.
Especially as I'm not a sociologist.
Yes.
I have to be careful. Is it fair to say that the reality of sociology is the situation on the ground? That the reality of the application of sociological notions and theories and so on and so forth is reflected very accurately in per capita income, disease rates, longevity, standard of education.
Another question, comment? Right in the back?
I just want to ask in relation to the protest that the last speaker mentioned and the articulation of the principles in the book. How does these principles align with Jensen's pedagogy of reconciliation?
Okay, can we just get one last comment and we'll get the speakers to respond, including Peter and Jeremy. Okay, the last comment right here. Can you just introduce yourself? Sorry,
my name is Matthew Williamson from Migration Studies. I wanted to link up 2 points. One that Jeremy made, and also to speak about to Carl's view about violence. And I think Jeremy made a very important point about looking for these forms of continuity in amid the disorder. And it does seem that if one is looking at violence and xenophobic violence, that if one sees violence as a sort of communal, not just a sort of visceral attack, which obviously it is, when it's a learned act, how you burn a tire, how you murder, these things are learned, but also as a symbolic and communicative act. It does seem like there is an immense amount of continuity between present-day violence and the violence from the 1980s in the East End to the violence of the transition to what's happening now. And I just wanted to, if you could speak a bit to how you trace that kind of continuity of violence, and if you can use Bourdieu to do that.
Carl?